Hi, we're joined today at the Legatum Institute by Dr. Gerard Lyons, who is a former city economist and now chief economic advisor to Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London. His book, The Consolations of Economics, seeks to give a very optimistic view of the future world economy and the role of Western nations within that, projecting a global age that actually is better and more prosperous for all. Dr. Lyons, you talk about countries like the UK having a much, there'll be a larger cake, but they have a much smaller share of that.
That's right.
In the Institute, we take a dualist view of prosperity. So it's not just wealth, but it's also about well-being. How do you see Britain in the future going about getting its share of that cake? Do you see a significant change in the way we do that? And what impact do you think that may have on prosperity?
Okay, well, in terms of the book, I talk about the key drivers of the global economy: economic, financial power, soft power, hard power, and policy making, and how all of these are combining to, in my view, provide us with a very strong period of global growth in the next couple of decades. And in that environment, coming back to your question, I think the countries that will do well will be those that have one of the three C's: the cash, the commodities, or the creativity. And when we look at it from a British perspective, the cash is about the financial resources, and despite levels of debt, we do have a pretty good financial sector. Commodities, we don't have too many of those, but it's really the other C, the creativity. And your question, I think, highlights the fact that Britain needs to really focus on its creativity, adapting, changing, playing to its strengths, and really positioning itself in a changing, growing global economy.
So a much more creative century for Britain, perhaps?
Yeah, well, not just for Britain, I think for many other parts of the world. In fact, I would argue, and in the book I talk about industrial revolutions, but in many respects we're seeing a combination of factors together leading to what I would call the fifth industrial revolution. And many people disagree about the previous ones, but in essence we've had four. But whatever the number you think we're at, the next few years look, in my mind, to provide us with a period of innovation, inspiration and investment around different parts of the world. And that helps Britain to become maybe more creative. But certainly I think it's a positive one, not just for Britain, but for many countries.
You're both a serious economist, but also you have your political hat in your work with Boris Johnson. In this context, a comment that you make, I think, in the book, that there's this tension between economists trying to protect the market forces from the short-termism of politicians. That's particularly interesting. This short-termism, specifically in the context of the changes you say need to be made insofar as greater market freedoms, free trade, addressing the issue of demographics, and the problem of the European welfare state. Is it the short-termism that you think is the biggest threat to prosperity, and what can we actually do about that?
Short-termism, I think, is a problem. Also, I think there's, in economics, a status quo bias. There's a tendency to often think that where we are now is where we will always be. For instance, before the financial crisis, I was very pessimistic. Now I'm optimistic. What I find is the consensus before the crisis was too optimistic, and now the consensus is too pessimistic. But in terms of your question, I think it's about getting the balance right between the public and the private sector. I tend not to take the view that all public is bad, all private is good. I think it's important to look at the right area of competencies, for want of a better word. If we look in the UK, the Olympics were a great success. Public, private sector working together, clear budgets, clear guideline, clear incentives. So I think in terms of the economy, it's often about getting the incentives right. And then from a policy perspective, it's about making sure you create an enabling environment in which the private sector, in which individuals can do whatever they want to do. It's not about micromanaging, it's about getting those big levers right, and then let people, firms, businesses do whatever they want to do.
So you're optimistic that we can get politicians to take a slightly longer term view?
Yeah, well, I think politicians need to provide leadership and vision, but too often they respond to the short term because that's where the public is focusing.
Absolutely.
And it's about winning the next election. But there's always the need from a policy, political, whatever perspective to have quick wins. But far, far more importantly, I would argue, is about having a longer term strategic vision. Here in the United Kingdom, the general public understands the need for challenges to be addressed. They understand trade-offs, but they can only accept that if there's a longer term vision and someone puts it in context.
Final question for you.
Okay.
Hypothetical scenario, you are Chief Economic Advisor to a Boris Johnson-led government. What is the first policy recommendation you would make?
There's quite a few sort of assumptions within that question. Let's answer it in a different way. Whoever is in power in the United Kingdom needs to, I think, address some key issues. And it's really about, I would say, positioning Britain in the changing global economy. Now, coming back to some of the points I said earlier, there are quick wins. The macroeconomic environment is always key. But it's also the longer term perspective. It's about making sure that we play to our strengths. London is a global city. What we need to see is more of the success of London, not only being repeated in London, but being replicated across the UK. We need to see what's been called the 3 I's. David Smith in the Sunday Times the other week called it the 3 I's: investment, innovation, and infrastructure outside of London and the South East. So in terms of your question, it would be doing all that, but also keeping taxes down, getting the right regulatory environment, and making sure we get the right balance between the public and the private sector. Public sector does some good things well. We need to also allow the private sector to be enabled to do lots of other things well also.
Dr. Lyons, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.